Last year, I read this book, The Intellectual Life by A.G. Sertillanges, and it kind of changed my life. It certainly changed my intellectual life, and I think that to change one's intellectual life is to change their life at large. Not because the intellectual life is all there is, of course, that's all that life is, but as this book reminded me, life is a unity, and so to impact one of the parts is to impact the whole and therefore the other parts. And so everything is touched on, all of our life is touched on by our intellectual life. And so this book had a pretty profound effect on me. In this video, I want to discuss what that effect was, some of the ways in which it changed my thinking and the trajectory it has set me on. And I hope to share some things that I wish I had known sooner, some things that I hope will inspire, maybe give some direction to someone watching. So one of the concepts, I guess you could say, that really struck me is this idea of intellectual vocation, which wasn't an idea or a concept that was completely foreign to me. It wasn't something that wasn't on my radar at all, but the way in which Sertillanges treats it in his book shed this new light on it that made it all the more desirable to me, and I think appropriately desirable in the right way for the right reasons. And also, more than that, it showed me that this is not just something that I could do, but something that I think I should do, something that I have an obligation in some sense to pursue. So what do I mean by an intellectual vocation? Well, as he lays it out, it's something like committing one's life to the pursuit of truth, to the pursuit of contemplating and communicating truth. And one of the sort of aha moments that I had reading it is that this is something that can be done aside from one's day job, so to speak. He makes a distinction between that. His writing is clearly geared towards some people who will be farmers or plumbers who will also have an intellectual vocation. And he also treats it not just as an option, not just as something that someone could do, but as a sort of calling that at least some people ought to do. And as I read it, that seemed to be me, but I had at least two lingering sort of objections to this that I had been wrestling with for really the past several years. And as though speaking to me, he addresses these in the book. And so I'll share those two with you. They're related, but slightly different. The first one has to do with reaching the level of your own gifts, sort of fulfilling your potential, a kind of mundane concept that we're maybe somewhat used to. But the way it was crucial for me in this context is that sometimes I thought, well, something like an intellectual vocation should be left to the people who are native geniuses, who just have an intrinsic genius and they're just ultra smart, ultra creative. And as I think about it and look, I think honestly at myself, I'm not one of those people. I don't have this extraordinary intellect and so on. But what he points out is that the goal isn't to become someone else or to be able to rise to someone else's level. The point, the aim, the goal is to rise to your own level, to fulfill your own role, so to speak. And this carries with it a sort of realism, a realism that takes into account realistic constraints about my own nature, my own limitations in terms of intellect, as well as those things external to me, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And so taking all those into account, that can become an excuse. Well, I shouldn't do this because look at someone else who's more qualified or in a better position to do it. But he sort of takes that objection away or removes that barrier. And that was very, very helpful to me. And the second objection, if you will, has to do with how accessible rigorous intellectual work would be for someone with the constraints that I have, not just my internal constraints in my nature, but also constraints, practical constraints in my life. Is it realistic for me to then try to pursue something like this? And what Sertillanges shows is that it's actually really accessible. In particular, he gives some real practical advice on how to go about doing that. But his overall assessment is that, hey, if you can devote 2 hours a day, on average, 2 hours a day to this endeavor, that's sufficient for most people. It may take some people longer, or everyone will move at their own pace, and that's okay. The point isn't to hit some sort of metric or to measure yourself against someone else. Again, it is to fulfill your own potential, to pursue this in a way that is right and fitting. And so as I read that, I realized what's really required is discipline and patience. Pretty much everyone has 2 hours a day. Now, again, the point isn't that everyone ought to do this, but for those who are called to do it, I think 2 hours a day is pretty reasonable. And then, therefore, what's required is discipline and patience. Discipline to pursue that consistently, to consistently set aside something like that amount of time, and then to have patience because especially at that pace, for someone who can't do this 8 hours a day or something like that, the progress will be slower. And to have patience to endure, especially in those seasons where progress seems especially slow or maybe even imperceptible. But with discipline and with patience, it is attainable, it is accessible. And that was a key insight for me. The next sort of paradigm shift was this idea of what disciplines are foundational, that there are foundational disciplines and what they are. Again, this wasn't something completely foreign to me, but until I encountered it in Sertillanges' book, I didn't really understand how I was going wrong previously. What he points out is that no branch of knowledge is self-sufficing. No branch of knowledge stands on its own. All of them are intricately and intimately related to other branches of knowledge. They have antecedents, things that come before them, things that without understanding, you won't properly understand that branch of knowledge. And they connect and relate to one another. And to truly have understanding is to understand those connections and those relations. It's to not just have specialized knowledge about some specific thing that you're passionate about or interested in, but to understand how it relates to the whole, how it fits in the whole picture. And so the person who's serious about pursuing understanding, who's serious about pursuing and contemplating and communicating truth, has to do so with the realization that there's a connection between these disciplines, and it's a mistake to just pursue one discipline in isolation. In fact, he says that in isolation, what happens to these paths, the path that's following a discipline on its own, is that they become narrow, they wither and wilt, and at the first opportunity go astray. And so various disciplines relate to other ones in a variety of ways, and yet there are some disciplines that are foundational to everything else. There are some disciplines that you have to have some knowledge of in order to have long-term fruitful work in any other discipline. So what are those? Sertillanges identifies those as history, philosophy, and theology. These are the 3 foundational disciplines. And so no matter what discipline, what intellectual work you want to pursue, you need to have this foundation laid, theology, history, and philosophy, before you can go on to fruitful work in those other areas. Another key insight he gives is to lay your foundation according to the height you wish to reach. Think ahead to the height you want to build, and that will tell you something of how deep and how broad your foundations in these 3 fundamental disciplines need to be. So those are some of the key insights that I gained from the book. But I should say this doesn't do justice by any means to the work. There's so many little insights, little and big insights, that I'm still processing and thinking through and trying to apply. And maybe I'll cover some of those in another video. But these are the fundamental shifts that happened in my thinking that got me on a new trajectory in terms of my study. Whereas previously I was somewhat haphazardly studying and reading a little bit here, a little bit there. This helped me to see how that was a mistake and how I could correct it. And in lieu of that quasi-haphazard approach, what it led me to do was to study under some of the greatest thinkers of all time. To think of it almost like building my own school with my own set of professors or teachers that I'm going to study under. To study under the greatest minds throughout time, and to do so systematically and at least somewhat chronologically. So what I want to do now is unpack those things. Why the great minds, why systematically, and why chronologically, and what exactly do I mean by some of those? So we can start out with, why study under the greatest minds of all time? And of course, the question sounds a little bit silly. You think automatically, well, why not study under them? But in reality, if you ask it that way, why not do it? There are actually reasons that come to mind. Well, maybe a reason that you wouldn't would be that you don't have access to them. Or a second reason or set of reasons may be or relate to their accessibility. Maybe the greatest thinkers are too far out of my reach. These are great minds. How could I study under them? Is there too much of a gap that couldn't be closed by going to them directly? But those objections ultimately fail. These thinkers are accessible because they've left behind written works that we can engage with. We can engage with their minds and in a sense, sit under their teaching and learn from them by engaging with their work. This makes me think about something I recently read by C.S. Lewis. It's an introduction he wrote to the Incarnation by Athanasius. And in that, he cites Plato as an example of a broader phenomena, a broader recommendation that he makes to go to the original sources and to read these great thinkers rather than reading what modern people of perhaps lesser minds have written about them. And the point he makes is that Plato is a lot easier to understand than what people today are writing about Plato. Oftentimes, at least, people who write about the thinkers actually make them less accessible. We expect them to do the opposite, but that's certainly not always the case. And as I've done this, it has vindicated for me this idea. I have found that it is, in fact, these thinkers are, in fact, very accessible. So obviously, given the choice, we should study under the great thinkers. And it turns out that these are available and these are, in fact, accessible. But what about systematically? I mentioned I'm going to study under the great thinkers and do so systematically. Well, first of all, what do I mean by systematically? Essentially, I mean using a sort of process, having an order to it, having a sort of structure, not going about picking from these sort of haphazardly or at random. Maybe the best way to communicate the need for this is to give an illustration of building a house or maybe a palace, trying to build a palace of understanding. There's certainly some art that goes into that. You shouldn't just follow extremely rigid and strict rules. And yet, if you don't have any structure to it, if you don't follow any order, then it's going to be chaos and it's not going to last. It's not going to work. And so I wanted to follow it systematically with some processes that I would follow, with some structure to it that would keep it ordered. And part of that is the approaching it chronologically. Now, why did I pick chronologically? I actually wrestled with this one a pretty good bit. There was a good bit of internal debate that went on, opposed to doing it chronologically, opposed to something like thematically, or opposed to doing it by discipline, studying history first, then theology, then philosophy, and so on. In the end, I decided that the best thing to do would be to study the fundamental disciplines in parallel chronologically. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that what's actually taking place, what you're actually interacting with, is a great conversation, and many people have described it that way. There's this great conversation that's unfolded throughout time. And so it makes sense to listen to it chronologically. You can imagine if you were to listen in on a massive conversation, a massively important and in some ways complex conversation, you wouldn't want to just go and listen to snippets here and there. You would probably get somewhat confused. You would want to instead listen to it from start to finish if you want to really understand what's being said. And so this is a great conversation that takes place between these thinkers. They're not actually just thinking in isolation. When you go to read Plato or Aristotle or Augustine, these aren't thinkers who had ideas out of a vacuum. These aren't thinkers who lived in silos. They were entering into a conversation. They were responding to people in their same time, people before them. They were interacting with the ideas of great minds before them, and in many cases standing on the shoulders of giants before them. And so if we want to listen in on that conversation, it only makes sense to do so chronologically. Another reason is that these disciplines are intricately connected. It's important to remember that as we study things like theology and philosophy and history, these are not abstract ideas that exist in some ethereal realm. Rather, these are part of the real world, things that have really happened, and these are thoughts that have come from real people who lived in real times with a real historical context. And so the ideas are related to one another, the disciplines are intricately related to one another, but the people are also related to one another. To give a sort of illustration, to study these independently, to try to study history, and then after having studied history to study philosophy, and then after having studied philosophy to study theology in whatever order, would be something like going to pour your foundation and pouring all the water first, and then pouring all the gravel, and then pouring all the cement if you're doing a concrete foundation. And that would be a disaster. Rather, you need these constantly mixed together and poured together. And I think that's by far the best way to go about this endeavor. To cite a specific example, imagine trying to study and understand Augustine's theology without understanding the philosophy of Plato or Plotinus, or without understanding the history and the culture of the Roman Empire in which Augustine lived, in which he saw crumbling. So that gives you an idea of the trajectory that I'm on, the way in which I'm studying these disciplines, these fundamental disciplines in parallel chronologically, and why I chose to do it that way. But now I want to dive into a little bit more specifics on what that involves and how long I plan to do it for. If you read Sertillanges' book, The Intellectual Life, and there is a link in the description if you're interested, if you read that book, one of the things that you will come away with is the wisdom of living and working within the constraints of reality. In my case, my plan is to spend the next 2 to 3 years making an initial pass. And what that initial pass will include is a selection of works from the greatest and most influential thinkers, especially in the Western world. And so, for example, I'm not reading all of Plato's dialogues or all of the works of Aristotle. Instead, for Plato, I'll read things like the Republic, the Meno, the Apology, maybe 1 or 2 others because they are fairly short. And for Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, and I may read excerpts from another work or 2. But I'm not going to try to exhaust the works of these great thinkers in this initial pass. And what all that means is that I'm going to leave out a lot, and that's okay. What I think this initial pass will do is give me a discernible picture, a big discernible picture. Now, some parts of that picture are going to be grainy. In some areas of the picture, there may be holes and gaps and things missing. But that's fine. I think I'll have a discernible picture where I can understand the meaning of the picture, or understand what it's about, sort of the story that it's telling, the broad brushstrokes, so to speak. And then in the years to come, I will make more passes where I go back through, probably chronologically, although it won't be, right now this will be my focus of my study. Later on, it may be more of a sideline, but I'll continue to make passes, which will help me to keep the whole picture fresh in my mind as I revisit eras, sort of chronologically working through these thinkers. But it'll also give me an opportunity to visit those areas of the picture that are particularly grainy and increase the resolution on those areas of the picture where there are gaps, and fill in those gaps or those holes. So that's my plan over the next 2 to 3 years. Now I want to briefly give you an update as to where I'm at today in the process. So at the end of last year, I did a sort of trial pass where I focused on the classical era and read Thucydides and Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus and Augustine and Boethius. And in doing that, I learned quite a bit, and I think the things that I learned were helping me now to begin my work proper. One of the things I learned from that process was, don't forget the literature. I initially was leaving out key works of literature like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and wasn't planning to read Virgil and Sophocles and so on. And I've realized that really is a mistake, that getting insight into the theology, philosophy, history without these works is going to be very difficult, because all of these thinkers are often interacting with the works of literature, and the works of literature are also beautiful and helpful. Another lesson I learned was that I need to incorporate some writing. As I'm reading these and trying to engage with them and interact with them, I need to have some somewhat structured writing assignments that I give to myself to help me process my thoughts and organize them in a way that will help me to really understand and retain some of that information. And so now I'm at the beginning of my official work. I've just completed Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. So what I plan to do going forward is to make a video every month or two to sort of document this process, or this journey. I'll talk a little bit about what I've been reading since my last update, some big points that I've learned from that, as well as some things I've learned about the process in general, maybe some refinements that I'm making that would be helpful for someone else who is trying to do something similar. So the purpose of these update videos, as I just sort of alluded to, will be to document this process, but to do so in a way that will be helpful to those who watch it. In particular, helpful to other non-expert, non-academics who want to fruitfully navigate some of these works. And in doing so, I hope to inspire others and promote the pursuit of understanding and wisdom, opposed to just information and isolated knowledge. So as we wrap up, do me a favor. If you think that this sounds interesting, if you think that this will be beneficial or helpful, let me know in the comments below. And if you've tried anything or done anything like this yourself in the past, or are doing it, and you've learned something or have some feedback for me, I'd also really love to hear that as well. So let me know in the comments about that as well. And as always, if you like this video, if you found it helpful, hit the like button. And if you want to see more content like this and not miss it when it comes out, go ahead and hit subscribe as well. Now I want to leave you with an ancient proverb from something like 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, which says, "Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. And with all thy getting, get understanding."